about these subjects so much. And we don't necessarily have the, people say, oh, the world's all a bit fucked up, isn't it? Yeah, isn't that sad? Don't know what to say. That's the end of the conversation. We need to really get past that. We need to understand that we're all agents of change. We're all constantly interacting and shaping the world. And if we do that consciously and deliberately, we can create very different kinds of outcomes. We can literally shape the world. And we have to do it. This is the challenge of our lifetimes. This is what we're here to do. We would be foolish not to recognize that our place in time and history where we're at. So I'm going to refer you again to this book, and one reason is we went to a lot of trouble to write it, and it's sort of sequenced in the same way as I like to teach. And I tried to use some of the images you might recognize that we showed already. But also, it also gives up like a process to think about how you might talk about environmental things with other people. And I shaped the book in the same way as I tried to shape the course, which is, remember, you can download this as a PDF. If anybody's physically here, I have real copies which you can have. So, keen to get it out there. But Unit 1 follows the certainty of change. It talks about that. And so I sort of started the book like that, to follow us through the sequence. Even if we wanted the world to stay the same, that isn't going to happen. So how do we work with it? And instead of having the butterfly representing transformation, we used a dragonfly, just because we had a really nice photo of a dragonfly that we took in our field in Kaibodvak. The picture here, I won't show from the book too much, but this is the Azure window. It's a very famous landmark in Malta. And I thought about looking through a window onto nature as a kind of visioning thing. But also the truth is that after I took this picture, about a year later, it fell down. It's not there anymore. It was eroded away and collapsed. So I also thought, in an interesting way, that also represents change. It's a window onto change. So we've kind of thought about all of these things quite a lot. And there's a little bit on climate change. You can get drowned in information about climate change. But what we realized at the time was that we framed the whole book around the Paris Agreement, because what we thought was, the jury's out, it's done, we've decided, everybody knows that it's a crisis and we have to get off oil as quickly as possible. We've set some targets, these are the targets. We have to get from 40 gigatons of emissions a year to 0. The Paris Agreement frames it between now and 2050. They're now telling us, Kevin Anderson from the Rodale Institute of Climate Change is telling us, no, we've got to do that by 2035. We have to get 100% off oil in 15 years. And so start to think, so when we talk about a transformational journey, that's what we're talking about. And somehow we've got to ride that, we've got to seize that as an opportunity and see that as our way. That's what's going to drive us into the future. There's going to be this amazing creative process of getting the hell off of oil. And I put some stuff in there about the future generations, Bill Mollison, David Holmgren. It's all kind of in there, really. And then just making sure I haven't kind of missed stuff out. And we also put in a little bit is, again, if you can see that, that's Ironbridge. That's on the River Severn. That's close to where I grew up. It represents, because they built the first ever blast furnace in Ironbridge. The Industrial Revolution took off 250 years ago, just downstream from here, and that changed the world. I always wanted to kind of start an eco-centre environment project, and in some ways I always thought that would be the place to do it. It was the problem is the solution, But also I wanted to say is, we call this first chapter was the no blame game. It's not really, there's nothing to be gained by demonizing people for saying they were collaborating in some gross scheme or something, because they weren't, they didn't know. They had no idea of the impact that they would have. They never thought that there'd suddenly be blast furnaces everywhere and we'd change the atmosphere of the planet. But that's what we've done. We know that now. We absolutely know that that's where we are in time, and that's what we have to respond to. And we have to respond to that with creativity. So I put this in as well. Change is a certainty. And I've got a lovely cinnabar moth there, and a green city, forested city in China. we've got to visualize what that future can be look like. If you can't think of it, if you can't imagine it, it's not going to happen. And we need to think big, think bold, be, you know, ambitious, expansive in what we're thinking, but start local and start small. That's why we called it small and slow solutions. We can't, if we try and unleash big solutions, we'll make big mistakes. So we've also got to realize it's a bottom-up inclusive process. And people sometimes say to me, "Oh, Steve, you just you're just preaching to the choir. You're talking to people who already agree with you." And I absolutely disagree with that. And what I like to say is, no, we're talking to the people who are listening. What's the point of working with people who aren't interested in your ideas and aren't really actively working with you? You work with the people who are going to actually be receptive to those ideas and do something with it. So that's why we do these courses. And really, there's Greta communicating to the world about climate change. It's so important. We have many different voices coming from different sections of the community, and the power of younger voices or people coming from different kinds of communities is incredibly important. So a lot of the ideas that we've looked through are kind of, I've sequenced them in the book, so it helps you can go back and sort of think through the line of thinking that's behind the presentations that I'm making. And then when you get to page 24, there's a little story about a place called Chikukwa. And Chikukwa is in the Chimanimani district of Zimbabwe. And I want to tell you a little bit about that. So that's what I'm going to kind of tell a little bit more of that story, and by way of kind of illustrating the potentials of what we can do with permaculture design. But I'm going to try and go a bit slower than we did today, so we can kind of absorb the information a little bit more. Slow down. What's that? Oh, this is, oh yeah. Oh, that was all the preamble. Okay, we're starting now. Okay, I need more coffee. So, you can see my screen now, yes? Yeah, good. So, using permaculture to rebuild a landscape. I subtitled this, and Zimbabwe has been through a challenging period, you could say. They've had it's the most extraordinary place I think I've ever been. It's probably the most beautiful place I've ever been. Yeah, whatever. Just like there's loads of beautiful places in the world. That's just somewhere I connected with, and obviously so I had my first connection with permaculture too. Because of the economic adversity that they have experienced, you know, the Zimbabwe dollar completely collapsed. It became worthless. People do transactions through South African rand and US dollars. I think they got to a $1 billion note, $1 billion note. And actually, if you looked at it, if you held it up, the watermark said 500 million. But by the time they'd printed the paper with the watermark, the paper, 500 million wasn't worth anything. So they had to jump to $1 billion. So that's what happens when your currency collapses. What's interesting though, so the seeds of permaculture were sown in Zimbabwe in the early 80s, and Bill did a course in Botswana, and I think there were 6 Zimbabweans on that course, and I think I've met all of them. And that inspired them to start a permaculture training center, which is in Harare. It's called Fambids and I. There's a wonderful series of videos called Global Gardener with Bill Mollison. I think there's 6 of them, and he goes to different climate zones, and you see him, you know, hanging out with permaculture people. And the first one, I think the first one, he goes to Harare. He goes to Fambids and I, and he meets a guy called John Nzira, who's a young man in that, and he's now one of the leading permaculture lights in Southern Africa. I don't know if you've heard of John Nzira, Faya. I see you nodding. Great. I've got his book actually. Oh no, it's someone else. Dropping names. Oh, it's Anne Bailey and Walter Mugove. I don't know if you know this one. More and Better Food. This is a wonderful book too. Anyway, the seeds that were sown from that PDC went on to help create a training centre called Chimanimani, Harare. I did 5 days of training there. That was the first place that I went to. And it's this lovely little sequence there where they catch it in their early days on Global Garden. I think it's episode 1. So I'll try and put that in the course resources area for you as well. But that then inspired me to see the power of what one bit of training could do, and creating a little guild of people, 3, 4, 5 people, whatever it was, who then had this sort of knowledge. And one of those guys was a guy called John Wilson, and he went and then lived in Chimanimani, and then for some years, and then ultimately was behind starting the Chimanimani project. And it just so happened I ended up living in the house that John had lived in, it being become derelict, and we renovated it and turned it into a traveller's lodge. So I didn't even know, but I was walking in the same footsteps as some of these people. So, you know, it's just interesting. Anyway, so there's that little bit of background. So what's happened though is with economic hardship and really the collapse of the value of the Zimbabwe dollar is the permaculture projects have flourished. Because permaculture projects, by definition, are not overly reliant on external inputs. They utilize what they've got. They're growing, they're bootstrapping their way up with what they've got. And so in our world, in the Western world, we've always got another option. There's always some easy money that we can make. Or go back to doing the day job, or, you know, win the lotto, I don't know, get some funding, get a loan, inherit some money from your granny. We have all these other options. And so sometimes that makes us a bit complacent about how we might be going forward. And whereas if you have all your other options removed, you don't have focus on making the thing that you've got in front of you work. And that's what I feel has happened a bit in Zimbabwe. So I'm going to introduce you to the Chikukwa project. But you have to know this is probably the biggest and now most successful permaculture project in the world. Amazing, really. I mean, anyway, it's not amazing. It's you know, they've just worked hard. So anyway, I'm going to take you back in history a bit, and we look at our screen. So, Chimanimani, using permaculture to rebuild the landscape. The first picture I'm going to show you is of Wales, and this is behind the Public Institute in Llanfyllin, and in many ways has nothing to do with this presentation at all, except for we're on a slope, and we've been given this bit of land. I think I showed it to you yesterday, didn't I? This bit of land behind the institute in Llanfyllin that they've allowed us to cultivate. It's really progressed now. This was just at the beginning, and we thought about raised beds on contour so that everything doesn't slide down the hill. So simple ideas adapted from experience. Anyway, that's a total aside, but hopefully in some ways it will seem relevant for you later. Next slide is this design was done by a Zimbabwean artist called Kevin Huff, and it's the #1 selling t-shirt in Zimbabwe for a tourist buyer. And Kevin was someone who changed my life. And I said that when I first got to Zimbabwe and I connected with this farm, and then I met a mutual friend who told me that the farm was in distress and needed some help. That person was this guy. And again, matters of a totally chance encounter. Kevin's not around anymore, sadly, also. But before he died, he gifted that design to Children's AIDS Orphanage charity in Zimbabwe. So he used his art to connect global people to social outcomes in Zimbabwe. I thought it was a beautiful thing. And I just put that in there because this is a real narrative. I was part of this story. I was influenced by this. These are the people who influenced me. So I think this story is important. Okay, this is Chikukwa. These are not my photos, by the way. I nicked them off a website. I went here in, I think, 1991, and I met a German couple, the only white couple that were living in this valley. This is in what would have been the traditional tribal areas, whatever, homeland areas, when Rhodesia was a racist country, but South Africa, people had to, you know, were sent to their tribal areas. This is one of those areas. This is to the Chikukwa clan living in this valley. There's probably about 7,000 people there, or there were in '92, spread over 6 or 7 villages, and they would be managed by a sort of a guild of sort of tribal elders, if you like, older, more experienced people who make long-term decisions for that community. But also, I have to explain that within Zimbabwe, within its history as a colonial settled country, is the Mashona people from the highlands were displaced by incoming settler farmers. And there's the central plateau in Zimbabwe is some of the most fertile land in the world. And when I was there in 1990, that was owned pretty much by 4,000 white families. And everybody else been pushed out to the margins. This is what colonialism does, is it pushes people into the margins, gobble up the good land for export-led agriculture. So these people have brought their traditional farming methods and they brought it onto steeper, drier, less appropriate areas to live because they've been displaced by other things. So they haven't adapted their farming systems to suit what might have worked for them for millennia or centuries before, now doesn't work. And what we're looking at in this picture, and I want to really explore it, what you're seeing there is a landscape that's about to collapse and die. We're at a sort of a collapsed state, and it's dry, it's dusty, it's drying out. This is a very high rainfall area, by the way. We'll have 2 or 3 months of very, very heavy rain, and then it doesn't rain for the rest of the year, and it dries out, pretty much. What you can see erosion tracks from people and cattle. You can see very heavily grazed land. You can see bare earth everywhere. It just looks like little shrubby tufts of grass to me. I can see sandy earth everywhere. I see a little bit of terracing higher up. Almost no trees. Anything that isn't on a really steep slope has been grazed to the ground by cattle and goats. The thing that triggered the beginning of the Chikukwa Permaculture Project was, let's just say, I like to tell stories really, but let's just imagine the household living in that little settlement down there. There's 3 or 4 little huts there, there'll be a little family or community living there. And they get their river. Also, if we think about, look how steep the slope is above the house. And as the shape of the valley, as it goes from, as the shape of the valley sort of lessens off, that's where you start to get issues of water coming out. We'll talk about this a little bit later on in a bit more detail. So the settlement line often is halfway up a hillside, because that's where you start to get springs and issues of fresh water. So this is miles from the nearest tarred road. This is hours of driving, maybe 3 hours from the nearest tarred road, which ends at Chimanimani. Then you're off onto a dirt road. The only people in this community who had a car were these 2 German teachers that lived there. So this is a remote, vulnerable community. There's no taps. You get water from a well, or from an issue in the ground, and at this time, what happened was the wells went dry. And now here in the West, we've never experienced that. You turn the tap and nothing comes out. What do? You can't survive a day really without water. It's something you constantly need. So here's another way also that we look at things with permaculture, is we have a real sense of limiting factors. What are the things that hold you back? Why? Nature wants to be abundant. Why isn't it? Bill Mollison said, water's everything. You can value a piece of land by how much water it has on it. You can have 1,000 hectares, but if you don't have water, you have nothing. So think about that. Think about what that might feel like. To be 3 hours from the nearest road and you don't have any water. And you've got to then go further down the valley to a lower well, maybe negotiate with a neighbour to access where they're getting their water from. And then you've got to carry water uphill. Now, I don't know if you've ever carried water uphill. It's really bloody heavy. A litre is a kilo. So think about that. A litre of water is not much. That weighs a kilo. So what you're going to take no one can carry 50 kilos, no way. I mean, that's a lot, that's heavy, right? So one thing you don't really want to do in design is to have to carry heavy things uphill. So you want to try and work the other way around. And tomorrow's principle is around catching and storing energy. And one of the rules of that is you try and catch and store energy, especially water, as high in the landscape as you can, because otherwise you're either carrying it uphill yourself or you're pumping it uphill using diesel. Either way, you're losing the battle that way. You're going to lose that battle. Gravity always wins. I'm going to save you an awful lot of time and just tell you straight how it ends. Gravity always wins, so kind of factor that into your designs. Really think about that. Okay, so these people then realized that they've got a serious problem. And what they observed is that when it rained, because the landscape had now dried out, they deforested it, they've compacted the soils, they've overgrazed it, the goats and the cattle sort of put ever more pressure onto the land as it starts to dry out and diminish. By 91, 92, you're starting to see families there that had malnourished. You see kids with their ribs sticking out and stuff like that. And it's like, and it's never been, it's never been like that there before at that time. And so really this story is about people skills. This is about the real skills and innovation and participation and problem solving of the people in this community. So a very small group of people from this settlement, they went to speak to John Wilson, went to Fanbits and I, whoever it was, to find out a little bit more. They'd heard this idea about permaculture, turning problems into solutions, but they didn't know how to approach that. They got a little bit of training, and they had some design input, they had some thoughts, and they sort of started to come up with a plan. What you need is a plan, a long-term strategy. So the photos that I'm going to show you are over like a 20-year period. So this is, let's say, this is a big story. This didn't happen overnight, but this is the scale of the transition that we have to make. And I've just told you we've got, what, 15 years to get off of oil? That's the kind of timeline we're talking about in these pictures. A transformational journey, that's what we're on, okay? That's what we're thinking about. Okay, so what happened then is these people had some ideas. Interested to know, anybody else there, what would you do in this circumstance? How could you imagine responding to a set of challenges like this? What would you do? Where would you begin? Community of 7,000 people spread over, a series of huge valleys in a very remote area. How the hell do you come up with a plan and then action that plan so that everybody's on the same page? And I think that's the extraordinary achievement, was that they managed to get the whole community, bit by bit, it was very difficult, onto the same page as them. Any thoughts? Where would you start? What would you do?
Water storing.
Expensive. What are we talking? Tanks, dams?
Could you use like swales to go with like the contour line to trap water when it's raining?
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. And really, I mean, yes, you're right too, Duncan. It's all about obviously trapping water. It becomes that's the thing. But it then becomes about how do you do that? And the realization is that the best place, the easiest place to store water is in the ground, it's in the soil. Not in tanks, not in dams. That's very useful. You need a certain amount of standing water, obviously for domestic use and so forth. But for nourishing plants, the best place for water is deep in the soil. And over time, it's only going to go slowly downhill. But when it's flowing over the surface, it sheets off. And especially when you get heavy rainfall, that top little centimetre of soil instantly becomes saturated, and then the water that's coming behind it cannot penetrate, so it starts to sheet over the surface. And you get gully erosion. It quickly opens up gullies. And what you're seeing behind where that settlement is a massive gully. It's now starting to just eat into the mountainside. And every year it gets steeper. So every year the gully gets faster, and it just, what can start us up as a little rivulet, within a year or two can be a massive sort of scar down the landscape. I've seen whole hillsides collapse there just from 1 year of bad cultivation. Because it's quite an extreme environment, so things happen quickly there. Okay, so it's all very well just saying build a few swales, and you're right, Alexi, but we're talking about miles of swales, miles and miles and miles. And we'll enlarge on what we mean by that as well in a minute, don't worry. So what happened was a group of about 5 people sort of had this plan, and they thought, okay, we can dig. Okay, let's just quickly go to this picture here. A swale is a ditch and a mound on contour. You dig it, and it has to be level. You're not trying to make water flow in any way. You're trying to make it percolate into the ground. And you do that by so excavating a trench and then putting the spoil heap from that trench on the lower slope. And the idea is you don't compact it. You want it to sort of remain quite loose, so it will absorb and hold water. And as you can see in the picture, what happens is that water then starts to percolate slowly into the ground. And that's what you want it to do. People sometimes ask, how wide should my swale be? How high should my swale be? What's the answer to that? Observe and interact. How much rain do you have? The more heavy your rainfall is, the wider and the deeper your swale needs to be. So it depends. And you find out what's right by starting small, observing, and then building on that. Again, we'll expand on some of these things as we go forward. So here's back to the story. So this little band of people who were literally 4, 5, 6 people started, and they did this in the dry season, because there's not much. That's almost like the equivalent of winter in Africa. Is there's not much to do, nothing's growing because it's hot and dry. So that's when you could do all your landscaping. So that's tough, right? You'll persuade people to go up the hill and dig a trench for miles that produces nothing. You know, that's the sort of that's what you're asking people, because it takes years for it took a few years for these things to start to have impact. So if you look into that picture, you can now see those lines running for miles. Those are swales, and they're absolutely level. They did it with an A-frame, and I'll show you about how to construct that. There's a lot of narrative actually on the Permaculture Academy website, because we're now doing a lot of this in a school in Rwanda. We're trying this on a project there. So we've got pictures about that there. So, but anyway, so what happened was they started digging their swales, and just this little group of people, and to a certain extent, a lot of people kind of laughed at them and said, "What a waste of time! Look at those idiots going uphill, you know, doing this thing." And which they hadn't seen before. Again, it's, you know, sometimes people aren't receptive to new ideas because, hey, that's not how we do things around here. So they made up songs about digging swales, and they had their activities, and they had their kind of dances, and they had their way of communicating to the people around them what they were doing. And some of the people who came to laugh at them ended up kind of joining in and helping them. And slowly, each day, a couple more people would arrive. And then someone would come, bring a few mangoes, bring some avocados, add that to the song and talk about who's there and celebrate what they're doing and make jokes about people who did it wrong, all this sort of stuff. This is the humanizing part of the process. Because you've got to remember, this was weeks and weeks and weeks and months of work sequentially over a series of years as they slowly started to change the landscape. Now, they're not just digging this mound and digging this ditch, is you've got to stabilize it. And they started to learn and experiment to think about different kinds of uses of plants that they could use to start to change and reinforce this landscape. And they discovered, I just grabbed this picture off the internet, but they discovered that there are some traditional varieties of grasses, not the kinds that farmers growing in their fields around here, but they have very, very deep roots. They're part of long-term fertility systems, maybe exist over long periods of time. And I started to think, could we identify a plant, a relatively fast-growing, really tough, deep-rooted plant that could help stabilize our landscape? And they found it. And it's this, it's called vetiver. Comes from the Himalayas. It's a marsh plant. It has a massive root system, as you can see. It can be up to 20 feet. In this picture, it says 5 meters, I think, does that say? But there's different varieties that can go further. 3, it says. So that's 9, 10 feet. But there's definitely varieties that go further than that. So different kind of varieties. But so plants with multiple functions. We talked about each element in a system needs to perform multiple functions. Okay. So we can unpack that idea because this is going to illustrate this quite well. But what can we do with vetiver? Well, it has this amazing root system. Okay, first thing we can say is it's a non-native plant. It comes from the Himalayas. So our first thought, if we were introducing it into a new environment, is it going to spread, become invasive, become a pest? Well, this plant is infertile. It does not set seed, and it doesn't grow from cuttings. It grows by subdivision. It becomes a clump. And what you have to do then, you start off with one, and grow it, and then you'll be able to lift up. We just tried it actually on a training center in Uganda. I planted 10, they call them slips, just individual vetiver plant sort of babies, if you like, no, subdivisions. And we did that in January, and we've already been able to dig them up and harvest them, what's that, in June. So it took about 5 months, and we get 40 plants off each one. So it's just, you know, you get quite a lot of biomass out of that. So the first thing is it's non-invasive, and you can subdivide it to be able to create more. So once you've got it, if you manage it right, you get more, you get lots more of it. Second thing is this, it's tough as hell. It's a tough old grass, and it can withstand bushfires. It will grow back from its roots, even if it's being burnt at the top. You can chop off the grasses though, and you can shred them up, and your goats will love it. And so they become a food as well. So that's another use. As a tough fibrous plant, you can weave it, and you can make baskets, and you can make even fine art out of it. It's a beautiful thing. It's a marsh plant though. Its specialism really is coping with too much water. So actually vetiver can be flooded, it can be underwater for 3 months, and it will still grow back. So it's tough as hell. And again, that's to do a lot with this root system. So within it, it has an essential oil. Vetiver essential oil is a component in about 70% of perfumes. It's highly valuable. You can also take that essential oil and you can use it as a mosquito repellent. Any of those really aromatic, scented oils, you know, citronella and all that sort of things, work very well at repelling mosquitoes. So how many uses do you need for your plant right now? We're feeding goats, we're stabilizing soil, we've got all these other yields from it potentially as well. So that's all kind of wonderful. But that's just the beginning of what you can do with it. And this is what's kind of really sort of super interesting is you can create what we call a vetiver hedge. So imagine you make your little swale and you make your little dam, your mound, and then you plant along that. You put your individual slips of vetiver, maybe 6 inches apart, maybe the width of your fist apart, put another one. What happens is as they grow, it doesn't take so long, those roots develop an anchor, you get that clump of the plant and it forms a hedge. It forms, and if you planted it absolutely parallel across the contours, you've now got a contour hedge of a plant which will now start to stabilize the landscape. So imagine what happens when that water flows downhill, it hits the vetiver, it slows down. If it's carrying material, soil and what have you, it deposits it, because as soon as it slows down, it can't carry it. So now instead of the landscape breaking down when it rains, the landscape starts to accumulate and trap any nutrients and soil and useful materials, organic matter that's traveling down the hill. You're intersecting it. Okay, let me just go back to this previous picture because there's a few points more to make. See, this is what I meant about the shape of the slope. This is the same view, obviously from a different angle. This is the same place as what we saw in the first slide. See how the upper slopes are really steep, okay? So once you get to a certain angle, you can't really do swales. You're in danger of creating landslides and stuff like that. You don't want to use that. What you need to do with the steep slopes is plant them with trees. And there's lots of different interesting strategies, which hopefully we'll touch on later, about how good ways to establish trees on slopes in a way in which it's not erosive. And so this is another thing which they had to achieve is there's no point in planting trees on the steep slopes because they're going to get eaten by the goats. fencing is really expensive. You can do living fences, but you've got to establish them first. So it becomes a complicated thing. So this goes back now to community organisation. So a lot of what this is called the Select project, and it's been running for 25 years now. Let's say it's probably the biggest and most successful permaculture project in the world. Started with 5 people. 5 people can change the world. But what they had to do then was to begin, they went from house to house, from community to community, village to village, and they started talking to people about what they were doing and why they were doing it. So a lot of this was about communication, education, community outreach, building relationships, making people understand what they were doing. So they had the support of the key tribal elders from the 7 clans that populate the valley. So this is another way in which you've got to, as much as we were just chatting with Duncan earlier about bottom-up change, we've also that change that's happening from the bottom also ideally needs to be some way reflected back by people in authority positions and stuff as well, because then that reinforces it in a way in which has worked really well in this instant. So look how our slope moves from steep, 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 and then suddenly it goes much flatter. We move from concave to convex, and you can see now that settlement line where it's shot to get houses and things are on that point. They call it a sweet spot in the landscape, where we move from the steep concave slope to the shallower convex slope. And was it the other way around? I always get those words confused, but you know what I mean. Anyway, you can see how the shape changes of the landscape. And so, and this is where you start to get springs and issues from water that's percolated in above. And what started to happen was, instead of it percolating in above, sheets down the hillside and causes erosion. So they had to persuade people that if you caught someone's goat on your land, you could tie it up and you're allowed to milk it for 2 days before you give it back to them. Kind of rules, like, I don't know if that's quite exactly true, but that kind of thing. I wanted a project again on an island in Kenya called Mfangano, and again they've got exactly the same problem there. People do not like to be told what to do. They don't like to be told that they can't let their goats go everywhere. So they had to engineer a social change in that community to think about how they manage their animals. And the rule was no grazing above that on the steep slopes above. So this here, the slope is less than 20 degrees. It's about 16, 18 degree slope. That's perfect for swales. Once you start going up, steep, 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 you want to do something else. You want to do maybe net and pan, or there's different kind of strategies which I haven't got into the slideshow, but we'll talk about later. So we're now trying to stabilize the landscape, but to achieve that, we've got to sort of get everyone involved. To get everyone involved, we've got to create songs, we've got to create stories, we've got to create a own mythology about ourselves, we've got to create a language that involves swales and vetiver and slopes and all this sort of stuff. Get everybody singing the song. I keep saying about singing and stuff because in Zimbabwe they're crazy about music. They play it all the time. Everything's a song. Every public meeting starts with singing. It ends with singing, and often there's a lot of singing in between. So it's cool, it's great. But that's a really great way to engage people and involve them. But you find whatever's culturally appropriate to wherever you are. Maybe that's not how we do it everywhere, you know? Okay. So look at the collective impact that they're having on this landscape. They've invested an enormous amount of work and energy into something that so far has returned no yield. So here's another thought about permaculture. Is it's kind of front loading. You have to do quite a lot of the work up front. Think how much effort and investment they've had to make to establish all of these features, educate the community, and what are we getting from it? Almost nothing back. Okay, but the yield builds over time, slowly, and this is one of the definitions of permaculture. Really is this: a good design starts with work. You have to do inputs, you have to do measurements, surveys, dig a lot of swales, plant a load of trees. It takes time and energy. But over time, those inputs go down and the return, the yield goes up. And at some wonderful moment, you cross over where suddenly the yield now starts to accelerate and the amount of work, the inputs that you're doing starts going down. That's good design. That's what we're trying to do. So we understand to get out of the mess that we're in, solve the problems that we're in, we're going to have to do some deep thinking. We're going to have to do some hard sums, have to do some homework, lay the groundwork, build our teams, educate people, but then there's nothing we can't achieve once we're all working together off the same sort of song sheet. Actually, song sheet's a good analogy. Yeah, okay. So these are some of our techniques. Once we've established a swale line, we could think, okay, we're harvesting water now. How can we utilize that? Let's think about, can we introduce some plants here? We already talked about legumes, nitrogen fixers, soil builders. Some of those things are actually very good fodder trees as well for goats and what have you. So we can start to stack yields into the system. We start to think about other returns that we might get. And we also might think short, medium, and long-term yields. So this is, again, we'll expand on this more on day 4. Is some of the things you get back quite quick, but other things maybe take decades before they yield back to you. You need to be thinking about all of those things. And again, that's how you create a system. Again, thinking about the stacking idea, you can build different potential yields into the system. You're not going to be making, actually, I gave some vetiver plants in May 2018. I gave a bunch of vetiver plants to a guy called Barnabe Muke Zangango. He lives in Rwanda. 18 months later, he sent me a picture of his first distillation of vetiver oil. How cool is that? So it's not a super long-term thing, but again, it takes time and effort, if you like, to make that happen. So okay, everybody happy? Happy's good.
Steve, just one question.
Of course.
If vetiver sequesters heavy metals, does that cause any problem with bioaccumulation in the goats that eat it and the humans that eat the goats?
I've never heard of that as an issue. I haven't heard of that as an issue. It might be something to look into. If you're in a very heavily toxified site, maybe that is a factor for consideration. We on the course, one of our courses, we worked with a wonderful lady called Jane Wageza, who's from Kenya, and she's a specialist. She just works in vetiver, so and use it for landscape stabilization. So we could find out more. There's actually a vetiver association, and there's all sorts of stuff. People really geek out on this stuff. So there was an answer to that question, Duncan. I'm sorry, I don't quite know it, but yeah. So now let's jump into that landscape. We're looking at exactly one of those farmers, Mr. Chisango, I like to call him. And so there's actually a video that goes with this. I posted it on YouTube, but they made me take it down as a copyright infringement. So sorry about that, but I do have the video. I'll find a way to share it to you. It's really inspirational, actually. Anyway, in that, they talk about, and in the evaluation of the project, maybe, yeah, kind of 18, 20 years in, they were saying 70% of the farmers now into cookware, if you went and asked them, tell us about your farming approach, they would say, I'm a permaculture farmer. 16 years in, something like that. 70%. To me, that's pretty much everybody. So that's the penetration that this has had. Okay, so let's go. And there's an interview with this guy on one of the videos, and we can see here is this man's vetiver swale. He's been constantly harvesting that, and he feeds it to his goats, which he now tethers and keeps closer to the house. Goats are pegged out; they're not allowed to free range anymore. That's kind of a standard they've established. And now that he's got the vetiver and the goat, now the goats are close by and in a pound or whatever, he can now start to harvest their manure, and he can compost it. He can layer the manure with the vetiver that's too tough to eat, and he can create a compost, which he can then return to the soils around his house. Now, traditionally, these people are more into cattle and things like that, and cultivation. They grow a bit of maize and stuff. But through permaculture, through education programs, they've really got into embrace all sorts of growing, massive creativity, all sorts of different kinds of gardens. What we're seeing here looks like a bit of pasture, but behind Mr. Chisango there, we can see these are nitrogen fixing shrubs, just like the Scots broom I showed you earlier. These are Plants he can harvest. A lot of them have seed pods that are great for chickens and goats. You can then harvest, trim the leaves, feed them to the goats, more compost. Every time you prune and trim back a nitrogen-fixing shrub like that, it releases nitrogen into the soil. If you reduce the crown of a tree or a shrub, its root ball will diminish, it will shed root matter as well, because plants are the same proportion above and below. Reduce the top, you'll reduce the roots. And then you're releasing carbon deep into the soil. So you actually, that's the soil building, nitrogen releasing process. So the more you crop them, the more you work them, the more soil you get. So we've got now his nitrogen fixing trees, got a lovely little pasture system. That little pasture system is creating a lot of manure, and he can put that onto his vegetable gardens and into his orchard. You can see the settlement is there. He's got a bunch of little houses there. And then beyond his house, there's his food forest. They weren't really, I didn't see fruit growing and things like that when we went there, maybe some bananas and things, but then suddenly now these guys are growing citrus, they're growing guavas, avocados, papaya, mango, you name it. It's all, their diet are diversified, the yield, so 20 years in, the next picture is the same landscape you saw in the first picture 20 years later. Remember, the dried out, eroded, gully erosions, all of that. Well, another thing they really learned to do, which was fantastic, was to just put lines of stones across the gullies. So where a gully started to form, and you do it in lines, you do it sequentially, work up the gully, put lines of stones across it, and you stabilize that with mud, and then you plant the vetiver into it. And then by the time you get back to next rainy season, it's stabilized enough so when it floods, it holds the flood. And again, instead of getting gully erosion, you get soil deposition and it starts to build up back in front of it. It's just observing the landscape, seeing the natural flows. Look at the consistency, the predictability of gravity is stuff always starts to go downhill. And if you slow that down, you stop that process, it starts to accumulate instead behind. So instead of having a problem, you have a solution. Instead of have erosion, you have accumulation. And this is like slowly developed over time. They didn't do this overnight. They didn't fly in JCBs from outside. And you can do that, but they were never going to have that opportunity in Chimanimani Valley because there's no road. So here's the thought as well is, we all have different opportunities and we have different limiting factors. So the limiting factor out there in Chimanimani Valley is no JCBs because it's too steep, it's too far, it's too expensive. Yeah, but hey, we've got lots of people, and all those people know how to work. They've got their budsers, they've got their hoes, they know how to work. So if you can mobilize people by inspiration and education, then you can change the landscape. Here in the UK, you've got some shillingi, you've got some money, you can hire a big JCB or whatever it is, and you can use an earth mover. Sepp Holzer, I'll introduce you to Sepp later on in the course. Yeah, it's on there, but anyway. He's an Austrian mountain farmer. Again, very successful permaculture farmer. You see in his videos, he's there with his JCB, digging out, he does a lot with ponds and water catchment, and he constructs these using a digger. People might say, that's not very permaculture with your big JCB. And for sure, what Sepp would say is, yeah, sure, I'm burning diesel, I know it. But I'm building a pond that's going to be a permanent feature of the landscape. If I do it right, it'll still be here in 100 years or so. So here's the thing. Maybe it's appropriate to use technology to burn some diesel to build a system, you know, to build something that will last. But maybe it's not appropriate to see that as a maintenance strategy to then maintain your system endlessly. If you keep using the needing to get the JCB out of the cupboard, you know, week after week after week, you're not doing it right. So I also like to say permaculture is not massively pragmatic. We don't say you can never do this. But what we say is we want to work with local and natural resources as much as we can. But sometimes if we have the opportunity of a tool or something from outside, we might use it. You know, we try not to, but we might even use a pesticide on occasion. If something was totally invaded by something we couldn't get rid of, I might consider it. It wouldn't be my first course, it would be my last course of action, but I might consider it. but not as a maintenance plan, not as a maintenance strategy, as a one-off application to get on top of that situation. So I can now build a system that doesn't need pesticides or doesn't need JCBs or whatever. So I'm just say, yeah, there's a bit of flexibility, a bit of just using what's available, making the best out of what you've got. I think that's allowed. Okay, so we've done 50 minutes. Right, okay, back to Mr. Chisango then. Here he is. Okay, a man outstanding in his field. He's, you know, okay, I'm going to go to that. This is the big reveal, the final photo, so you can gasp if you like. Same place, 20 years on. Look at that. Look at those, the upper slopes are totally forested. There's no erosion. There's no possibility of erosion now because that landscape is trapping and storing everything. This, I talked about this really big gully. This now is what was that huge gully. This is where the whole hillside was disappearing. And you can see, you can imagine, look at the slopes there that they're dealing with. Once you start to get erosion there, you're in all sorts of trouble. But once that's now fully vegetated, it's fully stabilized with a cleverly designed guild of plants, no problem. Hakuna Matata, as they like to say in Kenya. So here's some things now about Chikukwa Valley. Is when in the early 90s, all the young people, hey, they were going to Joburg actually, Faye, I've come to see you. Loads of Zimbabweans are leaving the country, especially the bright young, you know, people, especially the young males. A lot of the people from the village in Chimanimani, where I was, were heading first to Harare, then go to Johannesburg, looking for a job, looking for an opportunity, because there wasn't really any opportunity there. So what's happening now is people are going back to Chikukwa. They're going back to the villages. And you understand, like everybody, it's not that cool in the villages, not that much going on in terms of, you know, hip hop, cool, whatever. Except for now there kind of is, you know. Suddenly, this is smart farming. This is a different kind of thing of just toiling away, growing maize year after year. This is like rebuilding a landscape, rebuilding a community. So they're setting up training centers there. There are people now coming from all over different parts of Zimbabwe to learn about permaculture. These guys are some of the most experienced, most able permaculture teachers in the world. Chikukwa. I think in the video they said there's now 45,000 families involved in this program. 45,000. I think we started with 4 or 5 people. So look, if they can do it, think about what we ought to be able to do. So, yeah, the young people who are leaving are coming back to a degree. That's something that's definitely happening. They're setting up training centers where local, regional, national, and international people from other African nations are now coming to learn in Chikukwa. So they've turned what was a degrading, collapsing landscape with a collapsing society with kids with their ribs sticking out to a place that is now in food surplus. They're people who are going to learn, and they're rebuilding strong community again. All of that as a process. So I think that's I was only there in the early 90s, and they've had some serious challenges there since. So I don't know whether you know, but there was a tropical storm Idai that it crossed made landfall at Beira in Mozambique, which is one of the significant port city, a low-lying port city, which was 90% destroyed by this tropical storm. They've never had a tropical storm like this in this part of the world ever, and this is the strongest one ever recorded in southern Africa. And it crossed into part of Malawi. It went through very mountainous regions of Malawi, and then it came back out right through Chikukwa, and it affected the area very badly. Some of the people said, and so I have a very good friend, a lovely man I met in Uganda, Zimbabwe, called Evans Mangwende. I mention these names because they're all going to friend you on Facebook, so watch out. Evans, oh, there we go. Seth was feeling left out. There's Seth Holzer, there's some great videos of him, and he's kind of doing similar things, but in the Austrian Tyrol, where obviously different challenges and things, but he's got him working with gravity in the same way. So don't think this is all about the tropics. Although swales is generally something you more do in arid landscapes, we'll say that, but we can think there's a lot to say about water in permaculture. So yeah, we'll carry on with that. But I forgot what I was saying now. Storm Idai. So so Evans went there and he came back and he told me some stories. He recorded bits of videos actually as well, which he shared with me. They said it wasn't a storm, it was an earthquake. They said that's what they felt like. They said the storm was so powerful, the earth moved. They felt there were massive landslides in parts of the thing. Some people's settlements were completely destroyed and washed away. Whole families died, and then the house next door completely fine. Now, had that happened 20 years ago, that would have been catastrophic. It still had a really great impact. Vulnerable people, remote places, very powerful storms. There's not much you can do about that, even with good design. But that landscape is way more resilient and way tougher than it ever was previously. So think about climate change, think about the things that are coming at us. And almost guaranteed, we don't know exactly how, what form. Is it a virus? Is it a storm? Is it a flood? Is it a drought? Is it whatever? Well, this is what we start to think really deeply about the idea of resilience. How do we become resilient? I can turn that off now. How do I do to get back to a face talking on the screen? That was where stop screen share. Stop screen share. And then does it go? I can do speaker view.
I think it will just come back to you as.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I can just see Duncan. Hi, Duncan. I was trying to get it so my face was on there. So I don't know.
Gallery view.
I don't know. What's maybe how other people see it?
Top right hand.
Oh,
that's okay. Anyway, whatever.
Okay, speaker view. As compared to gallery view. Which one would you?
Oh, anyway, I was just trying to make it better because you were just saying before we could just see a miniature of me, but it's okay. It's coming.
We can see you, Steve, just fine.
Right, okay, good. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. So yeah, so the next thing really is about this idea about resilience. And I think this is something else that comes into something that Bill Morrison likes to say towards the end of the PDC, but said is let's within our observe and interact, within our thinking about analysis of our own lives, we've thought about the journey that we've been on and all that sort of stuff is think about your own personal resilience to potential shocks and things that might be coming through the system. Think about how dependent or reliant your life, your investments, your behaviors, your job might be on oil, might be on the petro economy. Because I think we're going to see big shocks happening within the petro economy. It could collapse. They actually pump billions of dollars into supporting the oil industry nowadays to keep it profitable, and it's not profitable, it's losing money. So you might ask, why are we doing it? Well, we're doing it because it's such habit. I don't know. Anyway, so think about that. And then think about this oil-based agriculture system, the thing that brings our food to us, especially through the Tesco delivery truck, whatever. We have no idea where it's come from. We have no connection to that, and yet it just arrives in a nice box on your doorstep. That's what Ian is competing against here, really, is that sort of invisible stuff that just materializes in your house to actually being involved in the process, having a relationship with the farm where it comes from, all that sort of stuff. It's a big deal. So I do think a lot of it, permaculture isn't just about gardening, it's not about growing, it doesn't mean you have to go to Africa and do big projects. I'm trying to show how principles and ideas, these concepts can fit together to fit almost any circumstance. And it can build resilience in a way that helps you resist the shocks and the things that are coming from the outside. And we kind of know they're coming. We don't know what form it was going to come. But I had a real sense of prescience when they started telling us about, we were speculating about what C19 might have as an impact, how that might affect our economy and stuff. You just think it's kind of hitting us in all the vulnerable points. But then again, there are so many vulnerable points, so it doesn't take much to hit you in that. So the reality of it is in the UK is that a lot of the fruit and veg that we eat comes from Spain. It's grown from the south of Spain, big polytunnels, for water that's been pumped up out of the aquifer in an arid area. So we've got a collapsing water table, and most of the labour force are undocumented North Africans who are working in Spain, and every now and again will get chucked out of the farm so they don't get nationalised or something. They don't get, stay in the country. So get health care or some good heavens above. And that food's then packed by unindentured labour, undocumented labourers, put into boxes, put on trucks, and then sent all the way, however many 2,000 kilometres from Spain all the way to UK, and then drives 20 times around the M25, all the distribution places, then it gets wrapped in plastic and then gets brought to you. There's not many steps in that chain that need to go wrong or to be stressed before the whole system breaks down. And that's kind of the problem. That's what we're thinking about, is the more complex the delivery system is for especially things as important as food and water, the more then vulnerable that becomes. So we can't just step out of this in one go. It's going to take a while to do it. But what we can do is think about the stepping stones, that journey that we might need to make to move from what we just seen in the slideshow, from a collapsing, eroded, negative sort of reality to something that's moving in another way. It's regenerating, it's building soil carbon, trapping more nutrients, creating opportunity for nature, all that stuff. And if, again, this is the idea about small and slow solutions, is if every one of us who's conscious of these things, or thinking about these things, starts making some changes in the world, make a compost heap, just start breaking down carbon, and let that teach you something about the carbon cycle. What's the stepping stones that goes from a piece of cardboard to become incorporated into soil again? What are going to be your partner organisms that you might work with to break that down? Now, we're going to start talking about that much more tomorrow, catch and store energy. Again, when we do produce no waste, we think more about the compost process. But you realize that the compost process is taking carbon that is otherwise going to oxidize and go back into the atmosphere as CO2 and bring it into the soil where it becomes a long-term asset, feed people, build fertility, and obviously help store water in the soil. These are the things that we need to start thinking about. And if we can get millions and then billions of people doing that in very small ways, we've changed the world in a very significant way. Think about the story of Chikukwa, how 4 or 5 people slowly change the narrative for the whole valley, and then once they've done it for the valley, it starts to affect the whole region. Then everybody talks, singing these songs, telling the permaculture story to each other. And you can create your own words and your own songs and narratives. They've certainly done that in Zimbabwe. But they've made it relevant to them in a way in which they can understand it culturally, remember it, and repeat it, what works for them, So, I don't make it very depressed or anything, but I don't know whether you come across the work of Jared Diamond. He's a professor of anthropology in the University of California, and he's a very clever, very interesting geezer. And he's written a series of books. The first book of his I read was called Guns, Germs and Steel. And it's kind of the story of of civilization. It's probably the most interesting book I've ever read, I would say. And there is a National Geographic documentary series based on that book called Guns, Germs and Steel. It's a bit it's a bit National Geographic. It's a bit sort of some Disney-esque bits around the edges. But if you don't got time to read the book, I mean, it's quite a weighty tome. It's worth watching that documentary. It's on 3 parts. It's on YouTube. Don't have to watch it tonight. Lots of time. Absorb these things and ideas. But the next book that Jared creates is Collapse, and it's called How Societies Choose to Fail or Survive, and it looks at the Norse in Iceland, in Greenland. Sorry, it looks at the Ashaninka, they're called Anasazi Indians in southwest New Mexico area. Hugely complex society. Vanished, disappeared. What happened? How did they, what happened to them? He explores these things in great detail. And what really comes through this book is how much evidence we now have. They start to explore through, in the southwest region of America, in the semi-arid deserts, there's a creature called a pack rat. And a pack rat makes a nest in the ground. It goes into like a crevice between rocks or under a rock or something like that. It makes a little nest of sticks, and it goes in there and it has baby pack rats. And slowly what happens, if it's very dry, they have very dry urine, because they're obviously desert animals. And as that seeps out into the nest, it crystallizes, and then the nest becomes foul and they abandon it. And they started to find, excavating around, geologists, that in the rocks there in the southwest desert there's these yellow blotches on the rocks. They couldn't work out what they were. And what they realized is that they are fossilized pack rat nests. That have been sort of caught, imagine, in a dry little crevice. It's dried out, all that kind of urine, or whatever was there, sort of turns into, I don't know, sort of crystallizes somehow, and it gets compressed maybe. And they can carbon date these things to within a year. And when they carbon date and they drill down into this pack rat nest, there's this yellow kind of thing, they can see all the pollen grains. And you can identify the trees. And you can see exactly what the flora and fauna was, where the Anasazi were, and where they built their amazing settlement in the deserts. And what they realized is there's a real abundance of a particular pine tree. It was a particular tree that obviously they were using for cultivation. And then suddenly in that timeline, it vanishes. And suddenly, instead of being able to make their society work with local resources, they now have to migrate to a valley away, or go some tens of miles away to start bringing in resources from further away. And that's what he realizes. That was when their society started to collapse. It's because you become more and more reliant on resources that are coming from ever farther away. So you get trapped into this cycle of diminishing returns, where you're working ever a bit harder, you're walking a bit further every day. It's the same thing with your firewood. Imagine this. You gather the firewood, what? As near as possible from home. So after a few years, you're walking further. And as you're walking further, you can't carry as much because you get tired. And you're spending more and more of your day walking further and further to bring back less and less wood. In economics, we call this the law of diminishing returns. It gets to a point where it just doesn't work anymore. It's not worth the effort of going all that way to carry the wood back. You're better off staying there and making a new camp. So literally, it's what happened. You suddenly find these whole cities, they've just walked away from them. And it's because they suddenly stopped working, because they've literally overtaxed the resource base from within the environs. So here now we've got planes and trucks and what have you, so we don't even worry about that anymore. But we're doing the same on an ever bigger scale. So we don't know what form our collapse, our unraveling, or whatever, our resizing, whatever of our society is going to look like. We don't know how it's going to affect us, but I think we're pretty sure it's coming. And the way that we're going to transition through that is through thousands and thousands of small and slow solutions, through lots and lots of individual innovations, by starting off, finding those little edges, finding those places where succession and regeneration can come from, and we grow out from it. We need to build alliances as well with other people, so that we understand each other, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And again, I find permaculture a very powerful way of being able to communicate our objectives. That's why I think the idea that it's framed by ethics is so important, because that should be non-threatening and non-challenging with you. All I'm trying to do is build a mutually beneficial relationship with you to find out how we can, in some way, work with each other and help each other. That's it. That's as threatening as it gets. I understand. You have to understand. I'm totally honest with you. I'm here to try and meet my own needs the best as I can. But in recognizing that in me, I'm recognizing that in you. We are not trying to compete. We're not trying to occupy the same space. I'm that little air plant out on the wire, trying to find my little space in society where I'm not, in conflict with someone else. I can, again, that's what Charles Darwin's given us. Is that's the mechanism of evolution. Is things both moving away from each other, but also building partnerships and building relationships. So, and think of the relationships that the people in Cook were made. Think of the learning that they've achieved by kind of starting off with nothing. They didn't know what permaculture was. They had no idea. But as the process have gone into it, they've now become maybe some of the world's experts in it. Because it's not just the technique of digging a swale or planting some vetiver or putting some fruit trees in. It's about knowing how to motivate people to do that. You can't do it all by yourself. You've got to sort of build teams and alliances. So That's why I think, that's why, you know, I stand by permaculture on that really, is that my personal life experiences of it's constantly been useful. I've seen lots and lots of examples of how people have used it really effectively to create change, to create regeneration. And we're better to be than to talk about that than here on Trevlock Farm, where we're now 10 years in. We just had another little interview where someone else came to chat to me and Ian, and just, you know, reflecting on that 10-year journey that well, Ian and I have been on. He was sort of scrabbling around for ideas at that point. And when I was looking around for people to work with, because we were trying to find the right place where we could teach from. And what also I realized is it's not one place. We start to build a network. We build many relationships with different places in transition. So any one of you that are, you know, in motion to creating your own dream, making your own thing happen, that becomes a great place to teach and learn from. Often, when you look at a really mature project, like we just say 20 years into Chukukwa, it's really hard to understand, to get the backstory. How did they get there? What were the things, the processes they went through to get to that point? So even when you're at the beginning of your journey, maybe only a year or two into what you're doing, you're in a great place to share information with other people, because you're just that little bit ahead of where other people are. You can begin to teach quite early on in this, because you're just sharing the perspective, and we're not pretending that we're experts. What we're saying is we're observing and interacting. We're learning by doing. We're learning by experimentation. Starting small, seeing what works, accepting the feedback, and then moving forward. Things that seem to work, we enlarge. Things that aren't working, we learn from. There we go. That's permaculture. That's what we're trying to do. There's a potential of it on a sort of a big community scale thing. It can happen at every scale, and a great place to start is right at your back door, because you get the most feedback from there. You can observe what's happening right by you. So tomorrow I think I want to task you to. We'll get a conversation about compost going, and you can tell me a little bit about if you've ever done any, and if you what you've learned, and any perspectives on that, because there's so much to learn. And me and Yossi, my housemate and Dragons, we've been playing around with various different composting systems over the last few years. So if you're lucky, we might show you some of Yossi's dog poo compost. If you're going to be good for that, though. Yeah, right. But it's great. I mean, it's actually amazing. So there you go. I'm going to sort of pause. I've done a lot of talking. We've got about 15 minutes. Any questions or feedback or anything like that, please just chip in. So I think we're going to stop recording. Lisa, you may stop recording. Paul may stop recording. We decided not to record.